This is Michael Luchies, Communications Manager for After School, the largest teen-focused social network in the U.S., and we're here for another edition of the After School Social Change with Technology interview series. Today we're talking about sex, well, not directly. We're talking about sex education in the 21st century. I'm joined by Mia Davis, co-founder of the Tabu app. Mia, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Let's jump right into it. What is Tabu?
So Tabu is a sexual health brand that promotes sex positivity and open conversations around sexuality. So we provide our audience with trustworthy content and an app that connects users with experts and community resources so they can take control of their sexual health. And it's aimed at the 17 to 24 age demographic mostly.
And where did the idea come from? How did you come into this business?
That's a great question. So this business derived from an experience, or I guess a lifetime's worth of experiences, and a realization that young people really don't know what they're talking about and what they're doing when it comes to sex. And the way our media portrays sexuality is really skewed toward gender stereotypes. So there's, stereotypes that men should be more sexually aggressive and that women are more submissive, and there's just a range of issues that this creates, particularly on college campuses when students are in a more free-for-all environment where they can do whatever they want, and they don't really know how to navigate uncomfortable conversations. They also don't know how to really protect themselves, whether it's using condoms or understanding consent. There's just a huge lack of understanding of these topics. So I realized that with my own friends, I realized that with my own experience, and really wanted to create something that helps eliminate some of these problems.
So today's high school students, I mean, you said the range is from about 17 to 24. For the high school students within your target market, where do you think they are learning about sex education?
So that's a huge problem that contributes toward a lot of this misinformation and just lack of information, is that less than half of U.S. high schools or states require sex ed. So they're not necessarily learning about sex in the classroom. And if they are, a lot of times it's abstinence-based education. Or, if you think about it, a lot of the teachers that are teaching sex ed are health teachers, or they're just, like a general teachers, so they don't necessarily have all of this information about sex. They're not necessarily sex educators. So if they're uncomfortable talking about sex, then the kids aren't necessarily learning the right information, and if they're learning it at all. So they're turning to the internet to ask questions, and a lot of times they end up watching porn to really fill those gaps because they don't know the information, and so they're just looking toward okay, well, if I can watch sex, maybe I'll have a better understanding of how it works or what I should be doing.
And what are some of the consequences of this? Not just learning from porn or what they can find online, which may or may not be reliable resources, but just kind of piecemealing sex education. What are some of the consequences of that?
So I think some of the major consequences is that there's a ton of misinformation out there. So a lot of people, even at older ages, believe a lot of myths. And I think that that's very dangerous because there's just a perpetuation of information that simply isn't true. So that's very dangerous. And I think also with porn specifically, when you're, and just the media in general, like I mentioned earlier, when you're seeing sex represented in a particular way, then all of your assumptions about that come from what you've seen. And a lot of the mainstream porn tends to be more, a little bit more like misogynistic, and creates unrealistic expectations for really all genders of the experience. It also lacks a lot of representation of different gender identities, sexual identities, people with disabilities. So if you're not seeing your experience represented, you can have some false notions about what is expected when it comes to sex.
So how do you see technology changing this conversation and how people get information on topics sexual in nature? And and I guess possibly a follow-up question is, what makes an app a more comfortable place and a better place to learn about sex ed?
I think technology has huge potential to help people learn about different topics, especially ones that are more sensitive in nature. But with that, like on the internet, you can find information about anything. There's endless amounts of forums and random people answering questions or posting information that isn't necessarily true. So that can be difficult to navigate, like what is trustworthy. And I think that's for us, we see a huge responsibility to make sure that our content is actually trustworthy and that it's verified by experts and connecting you with legitimate resources. And I think an app is a more comfortable environment to ask those questions because for us, when we're trying to become that credible brand that you know you can trust for information, and then also with an app, I mean, young people these days, they're connected to their phones, so you're constantly on social media or looking something up from your phone, especially with, again, something more sensitive. You don't necessarily want to be opening that up on your browser, like in school or at work or even at home. So an app really allows you to have a more personal experience with the information that you're looking for.
So we mentioned some of the gaps in sex education in schools. What about the parents' role? What do you see that as?
I think parents have a huge responsibility to help their children learn about these topics. I've been reading a lot of articles recently, and we just published one actually about teaching the value of consent at a really, just starting from when kids are really young. So teaching them that you don't have to hug a relative if you don't want to, and that you should be respecting your body and creating boundaries that allow you to really take control of your own body and self. And it's things like that seem small, but they translate into just your idea of how you relate with other people and how you communicate what your needs are, that parents can do at a very young age. And I think it's also really important for parents to just be realistic and honest about what their children are doing and what they're seeing. And they are seeing, I read a statistic that 90% of boys and 60% of girls do see porn before their 18th birthday. And, obviously sex is all over billboards and in magazines and on television, and even navigating, your own sexual identity or your gender identity. I think parents need to be realistic that their children are going to have experiences and feelings, and they need to be there to talk to their kids about it. And I think what's hard is that we're all human, and if you feel uncomfortable talking about it, then you're really not going to want to talk to your kid about it. But you kind of have to get past that barrier so that they feel comfortable talking to you, because I think most parents would much rather know that their child is at least being safe and has the correct information than that, they're kind of just going off and doing who knows what. And, I think creating a safe space is really important.
Yeah, and as a parent, I can say that I'm definitely terrified of those future conversations, but I'm much more terrified of not having them and having them learn from other sources that may or may not be good. So how do you guys source your information? Where do you, if we're worried about where our teens and other young people are getting some of this information from, where are you getting it from, and why are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're fortunate to have expert advisors on our team that have a background in sex education. We have gynecologists. We have, people whose backgrounds are really, like, they have their PhD in human sexuality. So people who have had the correct education in these areas. We also work with different brands and organizations. So we have a section on our website and an app called Our Basics. So it's kind of like a sex ed 101, and that ranges from gender identity to birth control to STIs. And we work with different brands that specialize in that topic to produce that content. So we're making sure that all of our content is verified and written by actual experts as opposed to just coming from online. That being said, we do have a blog, and that is content that is based more on like personal experiences and isn't really meant to be medically accurate. It's more so meant to showcase a range of experiences so that people can feel that human connection and know that they're not alone in their experience.
Have you had any, not necessarily complaints, but more concerns about the app and what it's teaching young people? And if so, how have you dealt with those?
Fortunately, so far, we've honestly had nothing but positive feedback.
Sure.
I think because even my own family is super conservative, and so a lot of my experience was based on the fact that I had an abstinence-based sex education, and, you know, I came from a really religious household, so that, I guess for me, I know that there is a lot of shame around talking about sex, and so I was nervous about that, but even my own family has been super supportive, and I think most adults are, like, they may not want to openly admit that this is happening with their kids or that this is, you know, going on, but I think in the back of their minds they know it and are happy at least that there's something to try to help, even if they don't want to admit that it's a problem. If that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. And once again, this is Michael Luchies, Communications Manager for After School App, and I'm talking with Mia Davis from Tabu. Now, what have you seen as some of the benefits or the results of what you've been able to do with Tabu?
Some of the benefits, let's see. I think just connecting young people with information and also trying to be more approachable and help them become comfortable with themselves has been huge. We have a college ambassador program, so right now we have about 30 reps, and just seeing how enthusiastic they are and how eager they are to spread the word and to inform their classmates about, you know, sexual health and just being more sex positive. I think it's a huge benefit, particularly on college campuses and for young people entering college, because we've seen a ton of cases of sexual assault on college campuses, and I think that so much of that is because young people aren't taught how to communicate. They aren't really allowed to understand what they want or what they need or how they should feel and how they should communicate that if they do feel uncomfortable about a situation. So that creates a lot of murky waters, and so to help people become more comfortable with themselves and comfortable expressing, you know, what they want, it's a huge benefit for everyone, really. I think that there's no disadvantages to knowing yourself and to understanding your body better.
After School, as you know, is an anonymous social network, allows people to share and get feedback and support anonymously, which is a key aspect of what we provide. Is Tabu anonymous?
Yes, it is anonymous. When we originally launched the pilot app, we had the option to be public, or like to have your profile be public, but everyone has a username anyway, so it was still sort of anonymous in that respect. But now it's just completely anonymous. Everyone just has a username, and yeah, it's anonymous. But except, actually, to clarify, experts, however, do have a public profile, so you can see like who they are and what their background is.
And how does this anonymity play into what people are comfortable asking and answering, in your opinion?
I think that the anonymity is hugely important with these types of questions. A lot of people just want to know, like, if they're normal, quote unquote, and they're not necessarily going to be comfortable asking that if it's a public. That's why I don't see this showing up on people's like Facebook news feeds, public questions about their own sexuality. So I definitely think the anonymity allows people to feel more comfortable asking sensitive questions.
And for parents, where would you recommend they go, or what should they do to best help their teen their child navigate sexual education related questions that maybe aren't being answered in school or from other places?
I think it's important for parents to really get comfortable having these conversations, also just to inform themselves. So I would highly recommend that any parent goes to our website and learns about sex. There's also Erica Lutz, who directs erotic films. She has a new initiative called The Porn Conversation, and that's intended for parents to help them. They have different guides for different age categories, and that's to kind of help parents navigate the conversation with their children. And I think even if you're not comfortable talking to your kids, you should at least have the information and know different resources that you can point them toward if you aren't willing to have the conversation with them.
And we talk a lot about having the overall conversation. Are there specific things within that are most important? So what conversations do you think are most important to have related to sex education among teens?
I would say the most important conversation is definitely consent and communication. I think that letting kids know that it's okay to not do something they're not comfortable with is hugely important, and making sure that they are asking for and giving consent all the time in all situations. And I think that's just important in general, because in life, even, I think we're often placed in situations and environments, especially young women, that we're not comfortable with, and feeling more empowered to not be in those situations and to get yourself out of those situations in a way that works for you, I think is hugely important. I also think having conversations about birth control are really important. I know a lot of young people avoid either going on birth control or even going to their own personal doctor for birth control because they don't want their parents to know that they're sexually active. But letting them know that, you would rather them not get pregnant or not get an STI will empower them to make smarter choices and healthier choices that are actually working for them. So I think birth control is a really important conversation. And then I think just not necessarily having this conversation, but allowing your child to know that it's okay to explore and understand what sexual identity means, what gender identity means, even if it's not for their own. Well, I think it's good for everyone to be aware of, but also just for their peers, and just being more understanding and more tolerant in general is important. And those are the conversations I think are missing from sex ed in general. Especially if it's abstinence-based, once you're saying just don't have sex, then you can't really have a follow-up about okay, well, if you are going to have sex, then how should you be navigating that, and what should you be doing to protect yourself? If you're just not having sex, then none of those conversations really follow.
And what's been the most interesting or shocking piece of information or result that's come out of you working with people through Tabu?
The most shocking. Let's see.
Or maybe just something you didn't expect when you first started it, things you've learned along the way that have been really interesting.
Well, I've learned a ton because I knew nothing to begin with. But I think one thing that's been really interesting for me is learning more inclusive language. So instead of always referring to, and we try to do a good job of being more inclusive, but instead of saying, men and women or girls and boys, trying to use language that is a person with a uterus, for example. Just because obviously there are people who do not identify, and knowing that there's the same sex and gender, and that the anatomy you're born with does not determine your gender. That for me was an interesting learning, and how to talk about it, I think, is still a learning curve for me, but something I think is important.
And for teens, what would you advise them to do to get the sexual education that they should have?
I would advise that they obviously read through our basics. I think that that is a good starting point, and I would just recommend that they ask questions and not to each. I mean, I think it's important for them to have conversations with their peers because maybe that helps them feel more comfortable. However, I do think making sure that they have the correct information first is important because a lot of the myths that are out there exist because it's your friend telling you something that is completely false and you believing it and moving forward with that information.
Great. And how can people download Tabu?
So right now, we're actually in the process of relaunching the app, so hoping to have that in the App Store by mid-February. And in the meantime, you can go to gettabu.com, gettabu.com, which has all of our basics and our blog and a little bit of information about the app and our campus ambassador program.
Great. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Mia Davis from the Tabu app for joining me today. Mia, thanks a lot, and good luck with Tabu.
Thank you. This has been great.
Take care.